The night glimmered with restless energy. New York City felt alive, almost too alive, as if the buildings themselves leaned in to catch a glimpse of the celebration unfolding below. The streets were choked with people, all surging toward Times Square, where the luminous ball waited to usher in the new year. I had imagined this moment for years, picturing myself amid the chaos, the confetti, the electric thrill of hope and possibility. Yet, as I stepped outside my apartment and scanned the crowded avenue for a ride, something unspoken gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. No yellow cabs. No ride shares pinging back. The city, so full of noise, suddenly seemed unresponsive. Just as I started to consider walking, a car pulled up in front of me. Not just any car, this one belonged to a different time altogether. It was a sleek, black taxi with polished chrome edges that caught the streetlights and shimmered like something out of a noir film. The paint was flawless, not a scratch or smudge in sight, and the wheels looked untouched by the filth of the modern city. I remember thinking how strange it was to see a vehicle like that in this day and age, but I was too desperate to care. The rear window rolled down, and the driver leaned out. "Headed to the square?" he asked. His voice was clear, unhurried, yet it carried a weight I couldn't quite name. I hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a cab. Maybe some collector's item restored by an enthusiast. Still, as I climbed into the back seat, a faint unease settled over me. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something older, like an attic sealed for decades. Photographs lined the dashboard, their sepia tones weathered and soft. There were faces in those photos, men and women in formal attire, gazing out as though caught mid-conversation. Their expressions unsettled me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but the kind of unease that creeps in when you're being watched without understanding why. "Name's Ray," the driver said as we pulled into the street. I murmured something polite, unwilling to offer much more than my destination. At first, the ride was smooth. The city hummed by, neon lights blurring into streaks of color. Ray struck up small talk, questions about my plans, whether I lived in the city long, how I felt about the crowds tonight. His tone was calm, but his gaze, reflected in the rearview mirror, lingered on me a second too long after each question. "You must have had quite a Christmas," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Family drama, huh?" My head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Ray grinned, his teeth startlingly white against the dimness of the cab. "That argument with your sister. Happens to the best of us. Holidays can bring out the worst." I stared at him, my pulse quickening. I hadn't told anyone about that fight. Not my friends, not my coworkers, no one. "You mentioned it when you got in," he added smoothly, as though sensing my alarm. "I've got a good memory for little details." I hadn't mentioned anything. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to reply. "Right. That must be it." Ray chuckled. "And that mark on your right foot, it's nothing to be self-conscious about. Makes you unique." I froze. I glanced down at my boots, hidden beneath the hem of my jeans. There was no way he could have seen the birthmark. No way. The city outside seemed to melt away as the car accelerated. Buildings turned into streaks of light, and the road stretched endlessly forward. My heart raced as I clutched the edge of the seat, willing myself to stay calm. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank. A trick of New York's eccentricity. But then Ray spoke again, his voice dropping an octave. "You know," he said, his tone sharp as glass, "people spend their whole lives running from things they can't escape. Funny, isn't it?" I didn't reply. I couldn't. The city blurred into an impressionist haze, smeared lights and shadows as the cab gathered speed. My unease now pressed down like a weight on my chest. Something about the air inside the car, it felt thicker, almost suffocating, as though the space between us wasn't entirely empty. I glanced at Ray. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. But that voice inside me, the one we're all taught to ignore for the sake of politeness, screamed to get out. "Could you slow down?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The words came out firmer than I intended. Ray didn't even glance at me. "Don't worry, Jill. You'll get there in time. Isn't that what matters?" He said my name so casually, so confidently, that it took me a moment to process it. I hadn't told him my name. My chest tightened, and I reached for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. "Relax," he said, his grin widening. "You seem tense. Let's make the ride enjoyable, shall we? Why don't you tell me about that dream you keep having, the one with the river?" My blood ran cold. "How do you?" I stopped myself, clamping my lips shut. This was impossible. I had never spoken about that dream to anyone, not even my therapist. The river was a recurring nightmare. In it, I stood at the edge of a rushing current, the water dark and endless, pulling me in with an invisible force. It wasn't drowning that scared me, but the sense that something waited beneath the surface, something that would claim me once I stepped in. I leaned forward, my voice a strained whisper. "What do you want?" Ray's laugh filled the cab, light but unsettling. "It's not about what I want, Jill. It's about what you've been avoiding." The car swerved suddenly, sending me tumbling against the door. My hands clutched at the seat as I braced myself. We weren't on any familiar street anymore. The tall buildings of Midtown were gone, replaced by empty, featureless stretches of asphalt, illuminated only by the pale beams of the headlights. "You said you wanted to go to Times Square," Ray said, his voice eerily calm despite the growing speed of the car. "But you didn't mean that, did you?" "Not really. You want to run. From what? Or is it from who?" I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off with a soft, mocking laugh. "You don't even know, do you?" he continued. "You've built a life out of avoiding the hard questions. Like why you really left upstate. Or what happened that night when—" "Stop!" I shouted, the force of my own voice surprising me. "Just stop the car." But the car only moved faster, the scenery around us dissolving into a dizzying void. My breathing turned shallow as the cab's interior seemed to close in. The photos on the dashboard shimmered in the dim light, their faces twisting, shifting, until I could swear one of the women blinked. I turned my head sharply away, focusing on Ray instead. "Whatever this is," I said, forcing the words out, "I don't want any part of it." Ray met my gaze in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, his eyes were different, too dark, too deep, as though there was nothing human behind them. "You're already a part of it," he said. "You've been part of it for longer than you know." The cab lurched to the side, throwing me hard against the door again. I struggled with the handle, pulling with every ounce of strength I had, but it wouldn't give. Panic swelled in my chest as I pounded against the window, screaming for help. The outside world remained eerily silent, a void that swallowed my cries. Ray's voice cut through the chaos, calm and precise. "There's no one to hear you, Jill. Not here." I turned back to face him, trembling. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Just let me go." He smiled again, the kind of smile that curdles something deep inside. "Soon," he said. "But first, you need to see." Before I could ask what he meant, the car jolted to a stop, and everything went still. The silence was worse than the motion. The sudden stillness pressed against my ears, amplifying my shallow breaths and the faint hum of the car engine. We had stopped, but the world outside was an unfamiliar blur of shadow and dim light. There were no streets, no landmarks, just an endless expanse of nothingness. I stared at Ray, my knuckles white against the seat. His expression hadn't changed, but the air between us was charged now, thick with something unseen yet oppressive. "I think this is where you get off," he said, his voice maddeningly calm. I hesitated, gripping the door handle again. It still didn't budge. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Ray tilted his head, considering me like one might a curious insect. "A place you've been avoiding for a long time," he said. "Or perhaps a place that's been waiting for you." Before I could respond, he turned his head toward the back seat as though addressing someone, or something, beside me. "You've been patient," he said softly, almost affectionately. "But don't worry, it's time now." My breath caught as the temperature in the car seemed to drop, though no breeze touched my skin. I whipped around, expecting to see. I didn't know what. The seat beside me was empty. Yet it wasn't. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the space itself was bending. I blinked hard, my eyes trying to make sense of the strange distortion that now seemed to pulse at the edge of my vision. "There's nothing there," I whispered, though the words were more for me than anyone else. "Isn't there?" Ray's voice sent a shiver down my spine. The distortion grew stronger, clearer. Shapes formed, blurry, indistinct outlines that seemed to flicker like the image on an old TV screen. And then, without warning, they sharpened. Faces. I gasped and pressed myself against the door, my hands scrambling for anything solid to anchor me. They weren't fully there, these faces, but they stared at me from the shadows, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and accusation. "Who are they?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. Ray smiled, but his eyes didn't reflect any warmth. "You don't recognize them?" I shook my head violently. "No, I've never." But my words faltered as one of the faces leaned closer, the flickering image stabilizing for just a moment. A woman, her features pale and strained, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name but felt deep in my bones. And I did know her. Or at least, I had seen her before. A photograph. One of the black and white pictures on the dashboard. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice breaking. Ray leaned back in his seat, hands resting casually on the steering wheel. "These are passengers," he said, his tone almost conversational. "People who've been here before. People like you." I shook my head again, trying to push away the implication. No, this isn't real. You're trying to scare me, and it's not going to work." Ray's laughter filled the car, a sound that was both amused and unsettling. "Oh, Jill. Fear isn't something you can bargain with. It's already here, sitting beside you, wearing the faces you don't want to see." I pressed my hands against my temples, willing myself to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. But the flickering faces didn't vanish. If anything, they grew sharper, more present, as though feeding off my denial. And then one of them whispered my name. "Jill." The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight, cutting through my frantic thoughts like a blade. My head snapped toward the source, a young man's face, pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken but locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible but dripping with pain. "I don't know you," I stammered. But even as I said it, flashes of memory, half-formed, fragmented, danced at the edges of my mind. A crowded street. A moment of hesitation. The screech of tires. Ray's voice broke through the chaos. "Do you remember now, Jill? Or do you need a little more time?" I turned to him, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "I don't know what you're talking about." He sighed, almost pityingly. "Denial can only take you so far. But don't worry, we've got all the time in the world to help you understand." The car's engine roared to life again, and we lurched forward, the distorted world outside rushing past in a dizzying blur. The faces remained, their eyes fixed on me, their whispers growing louder. And this time, I couldn't convince myself they weren't real. The car picked up speed, the world outside slipping into an incomprehensible smear of light and shadow. My stomach churned, but it wasn't just the motion, it was the faces. They pressed closer, no longer content with the flickering liminality of their forms. They were there, crowding the air around me, their whispers scratching at the edges of my sanity. "Stop the car!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the dashboard. "Let me out!" Ray didn't flinch. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, steering us into what felt like a void. There was no road, no horizon, just endless darkness streaked with faint lines of white and gray. "Let you out?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "Out to where, Jill? There's nothing for you out there anymore." The faces began to shift. No longer just watching, they moved closer, their distorted forms sliding into the front seat, their presence palpable. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear the faint scrape of their fingers against the upholstery. One leaned close to my ear, a man with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. "Do you remember me now?" he hissed, his breath icy and rancid. I recoiled, pressing myself into the door. "I don't know you. I don't know any of you." But the memories began to crackle through my mind like static, fragmented images forcing their way in. A woman standing at a crosswalk, her eyes meeting mine for a split second before the light changed. A man stepping out from a coffee shop, his phone in hand, not looking up as I sped past. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if the motion could dispel the images. "No, no, no." "Keep going," Ray said softly, his voice almost gentle. "You're so close now." The faces pressed closer, their whispers overlapping until they became a cacophony. They weren't just speaking to me, they were accusing me. "You didn't stop. You didn't look. You kept going." "I didn't mean to," I shouted, the words tearing out of me like a confession. "I didn't know." The car jerked violently, throwing me against the window. Outside, the darkness was shifting, giving way to fleeting glimpses of a familiar cityscape, an intersection, a park bench, the red glare of brake lights. "You knew enough," one of the faces growled, its features twisting into something grotesque. "You looked right at me." I clutched at my chest, gasping for air. The memories were no longer fragmented. They were whole, vivid, undeniable. The young man's face, the one sitting beside me now, his hollow eyes boring into mine, flashed through my mind. I had seen him before. On a dark, rainy night, stepping into the crosswalk just as I sped through a yellow light. "I didn't see you in time," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "You didn't stop," he spat back, his voice echoing with rage and sorrow. The car jerked again, the interior lights flickering wildly. Ray's face remained calm, detached, as though this chaos were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Regret is a funny thing," he said, his tone almost conversational. "It doesn't change what's done. But it makes for excellent company." The faces began to merge, their forms twisting together until they became a single, looming presence that filled the car. Their whispers turned into a roar, their accusations blending into a single, deafening cry. "You didn't stop." The car slammed to a halt, throwing me forward against the seatbelt. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest. The faces were gone. The car was empty except for me and Ray. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Ray turned to me, his expression unreadable. "The end of the line," he said. I looked out the window. The darkness had receded, replaced by a street I recognized all too well. It was the intersection where I had run the light, the place where everything had begun. The passenger door clicked open. "This is your stop," Ray said, his voice devoid of its earlier mockery. I stared at him, my body frozen with fear. "What happens if I get out?" He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's up to you." The whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging me forward. My hand moved to the door handle, trembling. And then I stepped out. The air outside the car was heavy, almost suffocating, with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The pavement beneath my feet seemed to shimmer, not with heat, but with a kind of faint, unnatural glow. Behind me, the car's headlights cast long shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw the shapes of those faces again, tall, looming figures stretching across the asphalt. The car door slammed shut. I turned, but Ray was no longer in the driver's seat. The vehicle sat empty, its engine purring like a distant thunderstorm, the dashboard lights flickering erratically. "Ray?" I called, my voice brittle, shattering the silence like glass. No response. The car wasn't just empty, it felt abandoned, as if it had been sitting there for decades, gathering dust that didn't exist. I turned back to the street. The intersection stretched unnaturally wide, the streetlights flickering overhead, their dim glow casting the world in a sickly yellow hue. I recognized this place. It was where it had happened. Where I hadn't stopped. The whispers returned, soft at first, like the wind rustling through the leaves. Then louder, sharper, more distinct. They were coming from everywhere, yet I couldn't see anyone. "You didn't stop. You didn't see me. You didn't care." The words grew, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. They weren't just sounds, they were inside me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I didn't mean to. I screamed into the void. My voice echoed back at me, warped and distorted, as if the intersection itself was mocking me. And then the light changed. The traffic light above flickered from red to green, and for a moment, the world froze. I heard the roar of an engine, distant but growing louder, a thunderous growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I turned, and there it was, a car hurtling toward me, its headlights blazing like twin suns. My legs felt rooted to the spot, the shadows of those faces dancing around me, their whispers turning into laughter. "You didn't stop," they chanted, their voices rhythmic and relentless. The car was closer now, the screech of its tires filling the air. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. The faces surrounded me, their twisted, ghostly forms closing in. And then, just as the car was about to hit me, it vanished. The silence was immediate and oppressive. The street was empty again, the only sound my own ragged breathing. The faces were gone, the whispers silenced. But something was wrong. The intersection was no longer just an intersection. The buildings around it were distorted, their angles wrong, their windows dark and lifeless. The streetlights flickered, their glow dimming until the only light came from the faint, unnatural luminescence of the pavement. I took a step forward, and the ground shifted beneath me, rippling like water. I stumbled, catching myself on a lamppost that was cold and damp to the touch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" A figure stepped out of the shadows, its movements slow and deliberate. It was the man from the car, the one I'd seen in my memories, the one I hadn't stopped for. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a cold, cruel smile spread across his face. "You didn't stop," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that felt unbearable. I backed away, my heart pounding. "I didn't see you. I didn't." He raised a hand, silencing me. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is what comes next." The pavement beneath me began to crack, dark tendrils snaking their way toward me like living shadows. The air grew colder, the metallic tang sharpening into something almost unbearable. "You can't run," he said, his smile widening. "This is where it begins." And then the ground gave way. I fell. The sensation was endless, neither air nor solid ground greeted me, only the stomach-churning drop into a darkness that didn't feel like an absence of light but the presence of something alive. The whispers surrounded me again, louder now, like a cacophony of screams muffled through thick glass. And then, I landed. The ground beneath me was cold, smooth, and impossibly hard, like polished stone. My knees buckled, but I forced myself upright, my hands trembling as they pressed against the surface. I was in a room, or was it a tunnel? The walls stretched upward, narrowing as they disappeared into a choking black void. I turned, expecting to see the man, the faces, the car, but the intersection was gone. In its place was a corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely, lined with countless doors. Each one was different, some ornate, others plain, some cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of light or shadow within. "Shoes," a voice whispered, soft and distant but unmistakably familiar. I turned sharply. There was no one there, but the air itself seemed to pulse with the word. "Shoes," it repeated, closer this time. My legs carried me forward, each step reluctant and heavy. The doors seemed to shift as I moved, the closest ones slamming shut while others creaked open, revealing glimpses of things I couldn't comprehend: a burning forest, an endless sea, a house with windows glowing red like embers. One door stood out among the rest. It was simple, unassuming, and slightly ajar. The faintest glow seeped through the crack, casting a thin line of light across the floor. My heart raced as I approached it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. Inside was the intersection. Not the distorted, otherworldly version I just left, but the real one, or so it seemed. The pavement was wet with rain, the streetlights flickered gently in the breeze, and the hum of distant traffic filled the air. And there I was, standing in the middle of the street, staring down at my hands as if they belonged to someone else. I recognized the clothes I was wearing, the exact moment in time. It was the night of the accident. The car sped toward me, its headlights cutting through the rain like twin daggers. I screamed, but the version of me in the street didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, as the car hurtled closer. I expected the crash, the impact, the sickening sound of metal and bone, but it didn't come. The car passed straight through her, as if she were nothing but smoke. And then she turned to face me. Her eyes were black pits, her face pale and gaunt like something long dead. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile, it was a grimace, stretched too wide, too sharp. "You didn't stop," she said, her voice my own, but hollow and wrong. The world around me began to ripple, the rain falling upward, the streetlights bending at impossible angles. The other me stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. "You didn't stop," she repeated, louder this time. I backed away, but the door slammed shut behind me. The walls of the corridor began to close in, the doors disappearing one by one as the whispers grew deafening. I turned, trying to run, but the corridor was gone. I was back at the intersection, the distorted version from before. The man was there, waiting for me, his hollow eyes glinting with malice. "This is where it begins," he said again, his voice a low growl. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This isn't." But the ground cracked open beneath me, and I was falling again. When I landed this time, I was in my car. The dashboard glowed faintly, the engine hummed, and Ray was beside me, his hands gripping the wheel. "Jill," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You okay?" I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. The intersection was ahead of us, the traffic light red. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. I began, but my voice faltered. "Don't worry," Ray said, his gaze fixed on the road. "We'll get through this." The light turned green. Ray pressed the gas pedal, and as the car moved forward, I saw them. The faces. Dozens of them, pressed against the glass of the buildings, staring at me with empty, accusing eyes. And then I saw the man. He stood in the middle of the road, motionless, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Ray, stop!" I screamed. But Ray didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. The car passed through the man, and as it did, the whispers returned, louder than ever, their words clear and sharp. "You can never leave." The car sped forward, the road stretching infinitely ahead of us, lined with doors that opened and closed on their own. I turned to Ray, but he was gone. The driver's seat was empty. And I was still moving, the road never ending, the whispers growing louder with each passing second. I stumbled out of the taxi, my legs trembling as the chill of the night wrapped around me. The driver didn't say another word, his expression blank, almost inhuman, as he sped away, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. Clutched in my hand was the crumpled piece of paper, the one he had insisted I take before leaving. My heart hammered as I unfolded it, the edges damp from the rain and my own sweat. Inside was an old photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of a house, their faces blurred and indistinct, but one figure stood out, me. I was there, unmistakably me, wearing clothes I'd never owned, standing among strangers. My hands shook as I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back, in a hurried, uneven hand, was a single message. "You never left." The breath caught in my throat as I glanced around, suddenly aware of how eerily familiar everything looked. The street, the lampposts, the rain-soaked pavement, it wasn't just similar. It was the same street from the photograph. And then I noticed the house, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. It stood just ahead, exactly as it had in the picture. I turned the photo over again, desperate for an answer, but my hands froze. In the reflection of the rain-slicked pavement, I saw them, shadowy figures standing behind me, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into silent screams. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the wind carried a faint whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Welcome home. Happy New Fear."